November 1, 1944. Eastleigh Field, Saipan, Mariana Islands. Lieutenant Colonel Takushiro Hattori stood at the window of his office in Imperial General Headquarters, Tokyo, examining reconnaissance photographs that had arrived hours earlier from Iwo Jima. The images showed American engineering battalions, expanding runways and dispersal areas across the Marianas airfields. The intelligence was clear and disturbing. The massive silver Boeing B-29 superfortresses were coming, and they would be operating from bases only 1,500 miles from Tokyo. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Hattori set down one photograph and picked up another, this one showing a B-29 that had crash-landed in China after the June raid on Yawata. Japanese engineers had measured every accessible component. They had calculated fuel tank volumes, estimated engine consumption rates, and modeled probable performance characteristics. Their conclusions defied belief. According to their analysis, these bombers carried enough fuel to fly 3,000 miles. Round-trip missions from Saipan to Tokyo would require exactly that distance. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The mathematics were simple, but their implications were catastrophic. American bombers would be able to strike the Japanese homeland regularly and return safely to their island bases. Unlike the earlier raids from China, where fuel shortages had limited operations to sporadic attacks, the Marianas bases would support sustained bombing campaigns. Hattori had spent the previous week trying to convince his superiors that the intelligence was accurate, that the Americans had developed a bomber whose fuel capacity exceeded anything Japan could produce or counter. The B-29 superfortress was not merely a larger version of existing bombers. It was a radical departure from conventional heavy bomber design, conceived in the late 1930s, when American military planners recognized that future conflicts might require striking targets thousands of miles from friendly bases. The initial specification, issued in January 1940, demanded a bomber capable of carrying a 20,000-pound bomb load over 5,400 miles at speeds exceeding 350 miles per hour. Such performance required engines more powerful than anything then in production and fuel systems that could carry unprecedented quantities of gasoline while maintaining acceptable weight distribution and structural integrity. Boeing's design team, led by Chief Engineer Edward Curtis Wells, had approached the fuel capacity challenge systematically. Standard heavy bombers of the era, like the B-17 Flying Fortress, carried approximately 2,400 gallons in wing tanks. This provided adequate range for operations over Europe, where friendly bases existed in Britain and later in Italy and France. Pacific operations demanded different capabilities. From proposed bases in the Marianas to targets in Japan meant missions of 3,000 miles or more. No existing bomber could fly such distances while carrying meaningful bomb loads. The solution required rethinking the entire structure of heavy bomber fuel systems. Boeing engineers designed the B-29 with multiple integral wing tanks that formed part of the wing structure itself. The inner wing sections between the fuselage and inboard engines contained 3 center section tanks with total capacity exceeding 1,300 gallons in standard production models. Outboard wing sections between engines contained additional tanks. 4 more tanks could be installed in the forward and aft bomb bays, each holding 640 gallons. When fully configured for maximum range operations, late production B-29 seconds could carry over 9,300 gallons of 130-octane aviation gasoline. This was more than the fuel capacity of a railroad tank car. The bomber's gross weight at maximum fuel load exceeded 140,000 pounds, making it one of the heaviest aircraft attempting regular combat operations. Taking off at such weights from tropical island airfields in high-temperature conditions would prove one of the aircraft's most dangerous characteristics. The fuel capacity alone meant nothing without engines efficient enough to convert gasoline into range. Here, Boeing's choice of the Wright R3350 duplex Cyclone engine proved crucial despite its notorious early reliability problems. This massive 18-cylinder, twin-row radial engine displaced 3,350 cubic inches and generated 2,200 horsepower at sea level in its initial military variants. Each B-29 mounted 4 of these engines, providing total power output approaching 90,000 horsepower at takeoff. More important than raw power was the R-3350's fuel efficiency at altitude when cruising at reduced power settings. At 25,000 feet altitude, cruising at 230 miles per hour, each engine consumed approximately 140 gallons per hour. With 4 engines, total fuel consumption was approximately 560 gallons per hour. With maximum fuel load of 9,300 gallons, a B-29 could theoretically remain airborne for over 16 hours, covering distances exceeding 3,700 miles. These theoretical calculations assumed optimal conditions: moderate winds, proper power management, no combat maneuvering, and engines functioning normally. Real-world operations would prove more demanding. The climb to bombing altitude consumed prodigious fuel. Defensive maneuvers during attacks burned additional gasoline. Japanese fighter interception forced the bombers to maintain high power settings and made formation flying necessary, which was significantly less fuel efficient than individual navigation. Engine failures, not uncommon in early R-3350 seconds, meant remaining engines had to work harder to maintain altitude and speed. Despite these complications, the fundamental reality remained unchanged. The B-29 possessed fuel capacity and engine efficiency sufficient for missions from the Marianas to Japan. Japanese intelligence officers examining captured documents and wreckage from crashed bombers in China understood this. Colonel Hattori understood this. What Japanese military leadership struggled to accept was that America had not only designed such an aircraft, but was now producing it in quantities that would overwhelm defensive capabilities. The roots of Japanese miscalculation extended back years before the first B-29 flew combat missions. Throughout the 1930s, Japanese military aviation had focused on producing highly maneuverable fighters and medium bombers optimized for relatively short-range operations, supporting ground forces or naval task forces. Long-range strategic bombing doctrine received little attention. Japan possessed no equivalent to America's B-17 or Britain's Lancaster. Japanese heavy bomber development had produced aircraft like the Mitsubishi G4M bomber, called Betty by Allied forces, which achieved long range primarily by eliminating armor protection and self-sealing fuel tanks, making the aircraft vulnerable to defensive fire. This design philosophy reflected strategic assumptions that proved catastrophic when applied to defensive planning against American bombers. Japanese engineers and tacticians assumed that increasing bomber range required sacrificing protection, payload, or both. The B-29 demonstrated that with sufficient technological capability and industrial resources, an aircraft could achieve long range while maintaining heavy defensive armament, substantial bomb loads, and adequate protection for crews and vital systems. The disparity in fuel system technology illustrated the broader industrial gap. American aviation fuel production utilized advanced catalytic cracking processes that produced high-octane gasoline in vast quantities. By 1944, American refineries were generating millions of gallons monthly of 130-octane fuel. This high-performance gasoline allowed engines to operate at higher compression ratios and manifold pressures, extracting more power from each gallon burned. Japanese fuel production relied heavily on synthetic processes converting coal to liquid fuel. The Burgess process, adopted from German technology, produced adequate quantities of aviation gasoline rated at approximately 91 octane on the lean mixture scale. Premium C3 fuel approached the equivalent of Allied 100-octane fuel, but remained in limited supply. Japanese bombers flying from bases in mainland Japan to attack the Marianas would struggle to carry enough fuel for the 3,300-mile round trip while retaining meaningful bomb loads. The few long-range attack missions attempted against Saipan required staging through Iwo Jima, refueling, and often resulted in aircraft running critically low on fuel during return flights. Beyond fuel chemistry, American and Japanese approaches to fuel system design differed fundamentally. American aircraft engineers had developed self-sealing fuel tanks using rubber compounds that swelled when punctured by projectiles, closing holes, and preventing fuel loss and fire. Japanese aircraft generally lacked this protection. Weight saved by eliminating self-sealing tanks theoretically allowed longer range, but in combat conditions, the vulnerability proved catastrophic. A few well-placed rounds could transform a fuel-laden bomber into a fireball. The B-29's fuel system incorporated multiple redundancies and safety features that added weight but enhanced survivability. Self-sealing tanks reduced fuel loss from battle damage. Fire suppression systems in engine nacelles could control fires that would destroy Japanese bombers. Fuel transfer systems allowed redistributing fuel to maintain trim and balance even with damaged tanks. These systems added hundreds of pounds to empty weight, but made the difference between a bomber returning safely despite damage and a bomber lost with its entire crew. Japanese intelligence analysis of B-29 capabilities began in earnest in June 1944 when American bombers operating from China launched the first raid against the Yawata steelworks on Kyushu. 75 B-29 seconds took off that evening, though only 47 reached the primary target. 5 aircraft were lost in accidents, and 1 was shot down over the target. Despite poor bombing results and significant losses, the raid demonstrated that American heavy bombers could reach Japan. More ominously for Japanese planners, the bombers operating from distant Chinese bases had reached Japan. Bombers operating from the Marianas, 1,500 miles closer, would be able to strike regularly with much larger formations. Japanese fighter pilots who engaged B-29 seconds during the Yawata raid filed reports that shocked military leadership. The bombers flew at altitudes between 8,000 and 21,000 feet, dictated by fuel constraints on the long mission from China. Even at these relatively modest heights, Japanese interceptors struggled. Warrant Officer Sadamitsu Kimura managed to shoot down 1 B-29, but his after-action report described expending nearly all ammunition and barely returning to base with his engine dangerously overheated from sustained high-altitude operations. Captain Teruhiko Kobayashi of the Imperial Army's 244th Sentai documented his unit's frustration in detailed reports that survived the war. American bombers operated at altitudes where Japanese fighters could barely maintain level flight, let alone maneuver for effective attacks. The B-29's speed at altitude, approximately 350 miles per hour, matched what Japanese interceptors could achieve in thin air above 25,000 feet. Even reaching bombing altitude cost fighters excessive fuel, leaving reduced time for combat and forcing pilots to manage engine temperatures carefully to avoid catastrophic overheating. These early encounters revealed Japanese defenses were inadequate against high-altitude bombers, but intelligence officers still hoped that B-29 operations would remain limited by logistical constraints. Raids from China required flying fuel and bombs over the Himalayas, a supply bottleneck that restricted attack frequency. Many B-29 seconds were converted to tankers, flying fuel from India to forward bases in China. Each combat mission required multiple supply flights. The inefficiency of this logistics system meant American bombers could not maintain sustained operations against Japanese targets. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. The American capture of Saipan, Tinian, and Guam in summer 1944 eliminated this constraint. These islands, 1,500 miles south of Tokyo, could be supplied by ship. Navy construction battalions, the Seabees, began building massive airfields even before ground fighting ended. Runways extended over 8,000 feet to accommodate the B-29's heavy takeoff weights. Thousands of personnel would be stationed on the islands to maintain aircraft, load weapons, and support continuous operations. By October 1944, construction had progressed sufficiently for the first B-29 seconds to arrive. On October 12, 1944, Brigadier General Haywood Hansell piloted the first B-29 to land at Easley Field, Saipan, The bomber, named Joltin Josie, the Pacific Pioneer, touched down on a runway still being finished by construction crews. Over the following weeks, more B-29 seconds arrived until over 100 superfortresses were positioned in the Marianas. The 73rd Bombardment Wing began training missions against lightly defended Japanese-held islands to give crews experience before attacking Japan itself. Japanese reconnaissance aircraft flying from Iwo Jima photographed the expanding American air bases throughout September and October. Intelligence officers analyzing these images made accurate predictions. Based on observed construction rates and intelligence about B-29 deployment schedules, they concluded that large-scale bombing operations against Japan would commence in late October or early November. This analysis proved correct. The first B-29 mission against Japan from the Marianas occurred on November 24, 1944. Colonel Hattori, examining photographs in his Tokyo office, knew what was coming. He had studied captured B-29 components, read interrogation reports from captured American airmen, and reviewed technical analyses prepared by Japanese aviation engineers. Every piece of evidence pointed to the same conclusion. The B-29 possessed fuel capacity sufficient for round-trip missions from the Marianas to any target in Japan. The bombers would be able to fly at altitudes beyond the effective ceiling of most Japanese interceptors. American production capacity meant hundreds of these bombers would eventually operate from the Mariana bases. Japanese defenses, weakened by years of attrition, lacked the capability to inflict losses severe enough to halt the offensive. The strategic situation was deteriorating rapidly across all theaters. American submarines were systematically destroying Japanese merchant shipping, cutting supply lines to resource-rich territories in Southeast Asia. The Philippines invasion was underway, threatening to sever Japan from its southern possessions entirely. Fuel shortages affected all military operations. Aircraft sat grounded for lack of aviation gasoline. Pilots received abbreviated training because fuel allocations for training flights had been slashed. The few experienced pilots remaining after 3 years of continuous combat operations would have to confront an enemy possessing not just numerical superiority, but technological advantages Japanese industry could not match. What Hattori could not fully communicate to his superiors was how completely American industrial capacity had shifted the balance of technological capability. The B-29 was not simply a good aircraft produced in adequate numbers. It represented systematic engineering excellence applied at industrial scale. Every aspect of the bomber's design, from pressurized crew compartments to advanced fire control systems to the fuel capacity that enabled strategic reach, demonstrated capabilities. Japanese engineers understood theoretically, but could not replicate in production. The fuel capacity question was merely one element of a broader pattern. American refineries produced high-octane aviation gasoline in quantities measured in millions of gallons. American aluminum production provided material for thousands of heavy bombers. American engine manufacturers delivered reliable power plants despite complexity that challenged Japanese industrial capabilities. American training programs produced crews faster than combat could eliminate them. American shipyards built cargo vessels to transport fuel and bombs across the Pacific. American logistics systems delivered spare parts and replacement equipment to remote island bases operating thousands of miles from continental United States. Japan possessed skilled engineers and brave pilots. Japanese industry could produce sophisticated weapons when resources and time permitted, but by late 1944, resources were scarce and time had run out. The B-29 seconds were coming, and they carried enough fuel to reach Tokyo. The morning of November 24, 1944, began with the pre-dawn ritual that would become routine for B-29 crews in the Marianas. At Easley Field, Saipan, ground crews worked through darkness to prepare 111 superfortresses for the first strike against Tokyo since the Doolittle raid 30 months earlier. Each aircraft required careful fueling, with ground crews pumping thousands of gallons into wing tanks while monitoring distribution to ensure proper weight balance. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Morgan, piloting the lead aircraft Dauntless-Dottie, watched fuel gauges climb as his bomber took on 6,400 gallons. This was not maximum fuel load, but represented the optimal balance between fuel weight and bomb load for the 1,500-mile flight to Tokyo. The mission planners had calculated precisely. Each bomber would carry 3 tons of explosive and incendiary bombs. The reduced bomb load compared to the B-29's 20,000-pound maximum capacity reflected the harsh mathematics of long-range operations. Every gallon of fuel displaced potential bomb weight. The Wright R-3350 engines started with their characteristic deep-throated roar, 18 cylinders in each of 4 engines firing in sequence. Morgan advanced throttles carefully, feeling the bomber respond as 90,000 horsepower pushed the massive aircraft forward. The takeoff roll seemed endless. With combat load approaching 135,000 pounds, Dauntless-Dottie consumed over 6,000 feet of runway before rotation speed. The bomber lifted reluctantly into tropical morning air, climbing slowly as Morgan maintained precise power settings to avoid overheating engines that had destroyed several B-29 seconds during training missions. Behind Morgan, 110 more superfortresses took off at intervals, forming up in loose combat formations for the flight north. The mission profile called for climbing to 27,000 feet, cruising at 230 miles per hour, dropping bombs on the Nakajima Musashino aircraft engine plant in Tokyo, then returning to Saipan. Total mission time would exceed 15 hours. Fuel consumption calculations allowed modest reserves for combat maneuvering and avoiding bad weather, but crews understood that arriving back at Saipan with nearly empty tanks was expected. The flight north proceeded smoothly for the first hours. Crews settled into the routine of long-range operations, monitoring instruments, checking oxygen systems, and watching for Japanese fighters that might attempt interception over water. The B-29's pressurized crew compartments meant crews could breathe normally at altitude, unlike Japanese fighter pilots who depended on crude oxygen systems that often malfunctioned. This seemingly small advantage had strategic implications. American bomber crews arrived over target relatively fresh after hours of comfortable flight. Japanese fighter pilots scrambling to intercept were already fatigued from the physical stress of high-altitude flight in unpressurized cockpits. As the B-29 formations approached Japan, weather conditions deteriorated. Cloud cover obscured navigation landmarks. Worse, the bombers encountered Japan's jet streams for the first time. These high-altitude winds, flowing west to east at speeds sometimes exceeding 200 miles per hour, had not been anticipated by American mission planners. Flying directly into jet stream headwinds reduced the B-29's ground speed dramatically. What should have been a 5-hour flight from Saipan to Tokyo stretched longer as bombers fought winds that cut their effective speed by a third. The jet stream discovery would force major tactical revisions in subsequent missions, but on November 24th, the immediate effect was increased fuel consumption. Engines worked harder to maintain airspeed against headwinds. The extra power burned fuel at rates exceeding mission planning assumptions. Navigator aboard Morgan's aircraft recalculated fuel reserves and informed the pilot they would arrive over Tokyo with less margin than planned. Return flight with favorable tailwinds would help, but the mission was tighter than anticipated. Over Tokyo, weather and jet stream winds disrupted bombing accuracy. Of the 88 B-29 seconds that dropped bombs, only 24 hit the primary target. Damage to the Nakajima plant was minimal. From a tactical standpoint, the mission was a failure. But strategically, the appearance of American heavy bombers over Tokyo demonstrated that the home islands were now within range of sustained attack. Japanese civilians who had believed their cities were safe from bombing now understood the war had reached them directly. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Japanese fighter response to the November 24th raid was limited and ineffective. The 4th Sentai scrambled Kawasaki Ki-45 Toryu twin-engine fighters, but pilots struggled to reach the B-29 seconds flying at 27,000 feet. Japanese interceptors lacked the high-altitude performance to engage effectively. Their Nakajima Ha-25 engines, rated at 1,080 horsepower each, produced perhaps 60% of rated power above 20,000 feet. Even when Japanese fighters reached bombing altitude, they found closing on B-29 seconds difficult. The American bombers' speed at altitude, maintained despite jet stream headwinds, matched what Japanese fighters could achieve in thin air. Ground-based anti-aircraft fire proved equally ineffective. Japanese flak batteries, designed for medium-altitude interception, struggled to reach formations at 27,000 feet. The few shells that achieved proper altitude exploded hundreds of yards from their targets. Of the 111 B-29 seconds that launched from Saipan, all but one returned safely. The single loss resulted from mechanical failure rather than enemy action. For Japanese defenders, the mission demonstrated their helplessness against high-altitude attackers. What shocked Japanese military analysts more than the raid's execution was the confirmation of intelligence estimates about B-29 fuel capacity. American bombers had flown 1,500 miles to Tokyo, maneuvered over the target for bombing runs, then flown 1,500 miles back to Saipan. Total mission distance exceeded 3,000 miles. The bombers accomplished this while carrying 3-ton bomb loads and flying at altitudes requiring constant power output from their engines. The mathematics were undeniable. These aircraft carried over 6,000 gallons of fuel on standard combat missions and could operate with even greater fuel loads when maximum range was required. Lieutenant Fumio Niwa, an engineering officer attached to Japanese intelligence services, spent weeks after the November raid analyzing B-29 fuel systems based on fragments recovered from crashed bombers in China and data collected from reconnaissance photographs. His report, preserved in Japanese archives, documented the systematic approach American engineers had taken to achieving unprecedented range. Niwa calculated that with 9,300-gallon maximum fuel capacity, B-29 seconds could theoretically fly 4,500 miles in optimal conditions. Even accounting for combat operations and reserve requirements, the aircraft possessed sufficient range to strike any target in Japan from bases in the Marianas or even more distant locations. Niwa's analysis examined fuel system design features that Japanese aviation could not replicate. American self-sealing fuel tanks used rubber compounds that absorbed incoming projectiles and swelled to seal punctures. Japanese engineers understood the principle but lacked the sophisticated synthetic rubber formulations required for reliable performance. American fuel transfer systems used electric pumps and complex plumbing to redistribute fuel between tanks, maintaining proper center of gravity throughout long missions. Japanese bombers relied on simpler gravity feed systems adequate for shorter-range operations, but unsuited to managing fuel loads measured in thousands of gallons over flights lasting 16 hours. The metallurgical quality of American fuel tanks impressed Niwa particularly. Examining aluminum alloy samples from crashed B-29 seconds, he noted the material's strength-to-weight ratio exceeded anything produced by Japanese industry. American metallurgists had developed aluminum alloys that maintained structural integrity while forming large fuel tanks integrated into wing structures. These integral tanks, which formed part of the wing's structural framework, saved weight compared to separate tank installations while providing enormous fuel capacity. More disturbing from Japanese perspective was recognition that B-29 fuel capacity represented just one element of a comprehensive technological advantage. The aircraft's 4 Wright R3350 engines each produced 2,200 horsepower at sea level, more than Japanese radial engines of comparable size. The engine's specific fuel consumption, the amount of fuel burned per horsepower hour, was approximately 0.5 pounds at cruise power settings. This relatively efficient consumption meant the massive fuel load translated into extraordinary range. American aviation gasoline quality further enhanced performance. B-29 seconds used 130-octane fuel, allowing engines to operate at higher manifold pressures and compression ratios without detonation. Japanese aviation fuel, primarily 91-octane with limited supplies of 100-octane premium fuel, forced Japanese engines to operate at lower power settings to avoid destructive detonation. The difference in fuel quality translated directly into performance differences between American and Japanese aircraft. The turbo supercharging system on each R3350 engine exemplified American engineering sophistication. Each engine mounted two General Electric turbo superchargers that used exhaust gas energy to drive compressor turbines, spinning at over 20,000 revolutions per minute. These devices compressed intake air, allowing engines to maintain sea-level power output at altitudes approaching 30,000 feet. Japanese experiments with turbo supercharging had produced limited results. The metallurgical precision required to manufacture turbine wheels capable of sustained operation at extreme temperatures and rotational speeds exceeded Japanese industrial capabilities in 1944. By December 1944, B-29 raids from the Marianas had established a pattern. Formations of 100 or more bombers struck targets in Japan every few days. Japanese fighter response remained ineffective. Anti-aircraft defenses destroyed few bombers. American losses came primarily from mechanical failures and operational accidents rather than enemy action. The strategic impact grew steadily as more B-29 seconds arrived in the Marianas and mission frequency increased. Japanese military leadership struggled to develop countermeasures. Interceptor units received orders to attack B-29 formations aggressively despite the altitude disadvantage. Fighter pilots improvised tactics, attempting diving attacks from higher altitude to gain speed advantage. Some success occurred when conditions favored attackers, but overall Japanese fighter effectiveness against B-29 seconds remained marginal. The few bombers shot down cost Japanese fighter units heavily in aircraft and pilots lost. Colonel Hattori documented the deteriorating situation in diary entries throughout late 1944 and early 1945. His writings reflected frustration with military leadership's refusal to acknowledge the strategic implications of American bombing capabilities. Senior officers clung to hope that Japanese spirit and determination would overcome material disadvantages. Hattori understood that courage meant nothing when fighter pilots lacked fuel to fly regular patrols, when anti-aircraft batteries lacked sufficient ammunition for sustained defense, when industrial facilities producing weapons were being systematically destroyed by bombers operating beyond defensive reach. The American tactical approach evolved rapidly. Initial raids used high-altitude precision bombing doctrine proven effective in Europe. Results against Japanese targets proved disappointing. Cloud cover frequently obscured aiming points. Jet stream winds disrupted bombing accuracy. Japanese industrial facilities, often dispersed among residential areas rather than concentrated in large factory complexes, proved difficult to hit with high-altitude bombing. In January 1945, Major General Curtis LeMay assumed command of XXI Bomber Command in the Marianas. LeMay, who had led bomber operations in Europe, recognized that tactics effective against German industry might not work against Japanese targets. He studied mission reports, analyzed bombing results, and concluded that dramatic changes were necessary. The fuel capacity that enabled B-29 seconds to reach Japan also provided flexibility for tactical experimentation. LeMay's revolutionary decision, implemented in March 1945, abandoned high-altitude operations in favor of low-altitude night incendiary attacks. The fuel calculations worked in favor of this approach. Flying at 5,000 to 8,000 feet instead of 25,000 feet reduced the fuel consumed during climb to altitude. Lower altitude operations allowed reducing fuel reserves, permitting increased bomb loads. Removing most defensive armament further increased bomb capacity. Stripped of guns and flying at night to avoid fighters, B-29 seconds could carry 7 tons of incendiary bombs instead of 3 tons of high explosives. The first low-altitude incendiary raid targeted Tokyo on the night of March 9th to 10th, 1945. 334 B-29 seconds attacked from altitudes between 5,000 and 9,000 feet, dropping over 1,600 tons of incendiary bombs on a densely populated area where buildings were primarily wood and paper construction. The resulting firestorm destroyed 16 square miles of the city and killed approximately 80,000 civilians. 1 million residents were left homeless. The destruction exceeded anything achieved by previous air attacks in history. Japanese defenses proved completely inadequate against low-altitude night attacks. Anti-aircraft batteries, expecting high-altitude targets, could not adjust tactics quickly enough. Night fighters scrambled to intercept but struggled to locate individual bombers among hundreds, attacking simultaneously across the city. The B-29 seconds fuel capacity meant bombers could remain over target for extended periods, making multiple passes to ensure thorough coverage. 14 B-29 seconds were lost, primarily to mechanical problems rather than enemy action. The raid demonstrated that American bombers could devastate Japanese cities while suffering acceptable losses. From March through August 1945, LeMay's bombers systematically destroyed Japanese urban centers. Tokyo, Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, and dozens of smaller cities experienced devastating fire raids. Japanese industrial production collapsed. The civilian population faced increasing starvation as food distribution systems broke down. Military forces lacked fuel, ammunition, and equipment. The B-29 campaign, enabled by fuel capacity that permitted sustained operations from distant bases, was destroying Japan's ability to wage war. Japanese fighter pilots who survived encounters with B-29 seconds described a sense of futility. Lieutenant Isamu Sasaki, who achieved 3 B-29 kills, later reflected that his successes came only when circumstances were perfect. Surprise attack from above with sun behind him against isolated bombers separated from formations. Against formations flying at altitude with alert crews, even the best Japanese pilots rarely succeeded. The bombers' speed, defensive armament, and ability to absorb damage that would destroy Japanese aircraft made them formidable targets. The fuel capacity advantage worked at multiple levels. Operationally, B-29 seconds could fly from secure bases in the Marianas, while Japanese interceptors had to operate from bases within Japan, vulnerable to attack and fuel shortages. Tactically, bombers with adequate fuel reserves could maintain formation integrity, make multiple bombing runs if necessary, and return safely despite battle damage. Strategically, the ability to strike any target in Japan from bases beyond counterattack range gave American forces initiative that Japanese defenses could not challenge. By summer 1945, over 1,000 B-29 seconds operated from bases in the Marianas. Mission frequency increased to the point where multiple raids occurred daily. Japanese cities burned. Industrial facilities ceased production. Transportation networks collapsed under sustained attack. The naval blockade, enforced by American submarines combined with the aerial mining campaign conducted by B-29 seconds, reduced merchant shipping to negligible levels. Raw materials could not reach factories. Food could not reach cities. Fuel stocks dwindled to critically low levels. The culmination of the B-29 campaign came in August 1945, when 2 specially modified silverplate B-29 seconds delivered atomic bombs to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. These missions, flown at high altitude to escape the effects of nuclear blast, depended on the same fuel capacity that enabled conventional bombing operations. The Enola Gay, carrying the uranium bomb called Little Boy, flew from Tinian to Hiroshima at 31,000 feet, released the weapon, then returned safely to base. The aircraft's fuel system, carrying over 7,000 gallons, provided the range necessary for this mission that ended the war. Part 3. The Cost of Truth. Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945. The final B-29 mission flew on August 14, with over 300 superfortresses attacking targets near Tokyo. They encountered no opposition. Japanese fighters remained on the ground, conserving fuel for the expected American invasion that would never come. B-29 crews returned to their Mariana bases, not yet knowing the war was effectively over. Their missions completed through cumulative destruction of hundreds of raids Japan could not prevent or effectively counter. The post-war United States Strategic Bombing Survey conducted extensive analysis of the B-29 campaign's effectiveness. Investigators interviewed Japanese military leaders, examined industrial records, and assessed physical damage to cities and facilities. Their conclusions were unequivocal. By August 1945, American air supremacy was complete and Japanese defenses were shattered. The survey noted that while debate continued about whether Japan would have surrendered without atomic bombs or planned invasion, the B-29's high-altitude capability, enabled by technological advantages including fuel capacity, had made this outcome inevitable once sufficient bombers became available. Japanese records captured after the war revealed how completely B-29 operations dominated military planning from late 1944 onward. Imperial General Headquarters devoted enormous resources to air defense, pulling fighter units from other theaters, constructing thousands of anti-aircraft positions, and training tens of thousands of troops for airfield defense. All efforts proved futile against bombers operating beyond effective defensive reach. The fuel capacity that enabled 3,000-mile missions meant American forces could strike from bases Japanese forces could not threaten. Colonel Hattori's diary entries from the final months of war documented the progressive collapse of Japanese defensive capabilities. Fighter units lacked fuel for regular patrols. When fuel became available, often pilots lacked experience because training programs had been curtailed. Experienced pilots who survived years of combat were physically and mentally exhausted. Anti-aircraft ammunition supplies dwindled. Radar systems that might have provided warning of approaching raids were destroyed or lacked power to operate. The systematic destruction of Japanese industry meant that even when problems were identified, solutions could not be implemented because manufacturing capacity no longer existed. The human cost of the strategic bombing campaign was immense. Hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians died in the fire raids. Millions lost their homes. Cities that had stood for centuries were reduced to ash. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki added over 200,000 deaths. American B-29 crews suffered losses as well, though proportionally far lighter than Japanese casualties. Over 400 B-29 seconds were lost to all causes during operations from the Marianas. Each aircraft carried 11 crew members, meaning thousands of American airmen died in the campaign to destroy Japan's industrial capacity. The technical achievement the B-29 represented extended beyond fuel capacity to encompass systematic engineering excellence applied at industrial scale. Every major component demonstrated capabilities Japanese industry could not match. The pressurized crew compartments, the remote-controlled defensive gun turrets, the sophisticated radar and navigation systems, the reliable engines that, once early problems were resolved, performed consistently over hundreds of hours. The fuel systems that managed thousands of gallons across 16-hour missions, each element reflected engineering prowess, backed by industrial capability that measured production in thousands of aircraft and millions of spare parts. American petroleum engineering provided the foundation for B-29 operations. Refineries producing 130-octane aviation gasoline in vast quantities, tanker ships transporting fuel across the Pacific, storage facilities on island bases holding millions of gallons, fueling systems that could pump thousands of gallons into bombers in minutes. The entire logistics infrastructure that delivered fuel from Texas refineries to Marianas airfields represented industrial capacity on a scale Japan could not approach. The range advantage derived from fuel capacity had strategic implications beyond bombing operations. B-29 seconds, modified for photo reconnaissance, could overfly Japan with impunity, mapping targets and assessing damage. Air-sea rescue versions could search vast ocean areas for downed crews. Electronic warfare variants could monitor Japanese communications and radar systems. The basic platform's range and endurance enabled multiple mission profiles, each contributing to American strategic advantage. Post-war interviews with Japanese fighter pilots revealed consistent themes. They respected American engineering and recognized that no amount of pilot skill could overcome technological disadvantage. They understood that the B-29's fuel capacity represented just one element of comprehensive superiority in design, production, and logistics. They acknowledged that by early 1945, Japanese defenses were so weakened that even perfect tactical execution could not significantly reduce bomber effectiveness. The development of long-range strategic bombing capability had been pursued by several nations before World War II. Germany developed heavy bombers but focused on medium-range tactical support for ground operations. Britain produced excellent heavy bombers but operated primarily from bases within Europe, where range requirements were modest compared to Pacific distances. Soviet Union built long-range bombers but used them primarily for tactical missions. America alone made strategic bombing from remote bases the central element of Pacific air strategy, accepting the complexity and cost required to produce bombers with fuel capacity sufficient for 3,000-mile missions. This decision reflected American industrial confidence. B-29 fuel systems required precision manufacturing. Wing tanks integrated into structural frameworks demanded sophisticated metalworking. Self-sealing materials needed advanced chemical engineering. Transfer pumps and plumbing required reliable electrical systems. Every component added complexity, but American industry possessed the capability to produce these systems reliably at scale. Japan, despite skilled engineers and determined workers, lacked the industrial infrastructure to replicate American achievements. The post-war Japanese aviation industry learned from B-29 technology. Engineers who examined captured aircraft and studied American manufacturing techniques applied those lessons to Japan's economic reconstruction. Emphasis on quality control, systematic engineering processes, and attention to manufacturing precision became hallmarks of Japanese industrial development. Former aviation engineers moved into civilian industries, bringing understanding of advanced production methods learned from studying American aircraft technology. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress flew its last combat missions in 1954 during the Korean War. By then, jet-powered bombers were replacing propeller-driven aircraft, and the technology that made the B-29 revolutionary had become obsolete. But the bomber's legacy endured. It demonstrated that technological superiority could overcome numerical inferiority, that industrial capacity was as important as individual courage, and that air power alone could destroy a nation's ability to wage war. The story of Japanese officers shocked by B-29 fuel capacity is ultimately a story about industrial warfare in the 20th century. The 9,300 gallons of aviation gasoline the Superfortress could carry represented more than engineering achievement. It represented the accumulated industrial might of a nation that could develop advanced petroleum refining, manufacture complex aircraft in thousands, transport fuel across oceans, and sustain operations from remote island bases for months on end. These capabilities, developed over decades of industrial growth, created advantages no amount of tactical skill or strategic cunning could overcome. When American B-29 seconds droned overhead at altitudes where Japanese fighters gasped for air, their fuel tanks heavy with gasoline that would carry them 3,000 miles, they demonstrated more than technological achievement. They demonstrated that modern warfare had become fundamentally an industrial contest. The side that could produce more fuel, build more aircraft, train more crews, and sustain operations longer would prevail. Japan, isolated from resources and lacking industrial capacity to match American production, could not compete in this contest. Colonel Hattori, examining reconnaissance photographs in November 1944, had understood what was coming. The fuel capacity that shocked Japanese intelligence analysts represented just one manifestation of American industrial superiority. The systematic destruction that followed, as hundreds of B-29 seconds burned Japanese cities month after month, proved that understanding correct. The silver bombers that flew beyond defensive reach carried in their fuel tanks the proof that industrial might had become the decisive factor in modern warfare, and that America possessed that might in quantities no enemy could match. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.